Welcome. My name is John Moriarty. I'm actually the senior manager of wildlife at Three Rivers. And at Three Rivers, wildlife ranges from ants and springtails, which are little snow fleas, up to deer and bear. So we don't just work with deer and turkeys and things like that. We work with the whole spectrum. And butterflies are one of the spectrums and one of the reasons we manage things. What I'm going to do today is talking about introduction, but also getting butterflies to the park. In one of the parks, and there's a few people in here that know me, that I like to work in, and one of the reasons I came back to the park district 10 years ago is Crowhasson Park Reserve. And on this, that didn't go well. So much for using the little red light. So all the kind of light orange is all prairie. And all that prairie has been planted in the last 50 years. So when we acquired the park from the farmers in the 60s, 3/4 of this park was cornfields. So when you walk through any of our parks, you go, oh, this looks so natural. Most of the parks in the park system were all different farmsteads. So a lot of it looks natural now, but it's fairly new. So Crowhasson, we started the prairies, were started in 1969, and the last chunk of grassland was planted in about 2012. And so we have basically this prairie complex that's inside the red line. It includes a number of wetlands and woodlands, but it's all managed by fire. So the wetlands that are in there will get burned from time to time. We burn through the woodlands. So it's kind of a mosaic in a lot of prairies, especially the eastern part of the prairie range. There were a lot of woodland edges and a lot of wetlands. You get out into the Dakotas and there aren't very many trees at all, but this part of the country and into Wisconsin, there was a lot of intermingling, but fire was dominant throughout the whole area. The one thing we do at Crowhasson is all these different numbers are different burn units. So when we go in and manage our parks, we don't burn all the prairie at one time. And if we did that, we wouldn't have many insects because a lot of the insects overwinter down in the grass, or the caterpillars are down in the grass. And if we burn an area, so Bailey, do you have a stick somewhere? Since technology doesn't seem to work. Yep, no, technology doesn't work at all. Okay. Got a little stick. That might work. So just for an example, here, like this one that I really bees in any 1 year. So 3/4 of the habitat would be there. So if we did burn out, the insects that were in this area 1 year, over the next 3 years, they would reclaim into the area. And that's what has happened all along. There's always been fires in the on prairies. Without the fires, there wouldn't be prairies. So it is something that's always been happening. It just used to be, they had 25 million acres of land in Minnesota that was prairie. And if, 1 million or 2 acres burned up, it wasn't a big deal. Now, when we only have 1,000 acres, we have to be a lot more careful to manage for the species that are there. So we have a very good mosaic system, always allow, whether it's the insects or birds to move around, they can go from site to site. So the other thing we do is make sure we have a lot of nectar plants. All the insects or all the butterflies and moths that use our parks, need the wildflowers for the adults, for nectaring. And we have about 100 species of wildflowers that we have added into the prairies over the last 50 years. They start flowering in April with the past flowers, and they stop flowering after the last heavy frost in October with some of the asters. Another thing that is important for a lot of the insects and a lot of the butterflies are the flowering trees. So in the spring, you'll start to see butterflies around, but you don't see many flowers. But a lot of the trees are flowering. A lot of the willows and the poplars are flowering, and they're nectaring on the trees. But it's not something you're not going to grow a willow stand in your front yard as a butterfly garden. So, that's the type of thing. But we do manage and try to be careful on, making sure that we have pollinators available all year long. And we don't just have them for 1 or 2 months, we have them for the full season. And we have a lot of butterflies. There's 150 plus species of butterflies and moths that are in the park. And of those, most, actually all but 2, have come back on their own. So we use the baseball analogy of if you build it, they will come, and they have come. So a lot of the butterflies are in the parks. These are some of the common ones. The upper one, this is the eastern-tailed blue. It actually has 2 little tails on the back wing. Cabbage butterfly, common buckeye, the red admiral, one of the sulfurs, and then one of the comma butterflies. And these are all butterflies that are using the prairies for nectaring. Some of them will feed, the caterpillars feed on grasses. Some of them, the caterpillars feed on trees. One of the more showy butterflies, or 2 of the showy butterflies we have, are the swallowtails. Everybody likes swallowtails. They're really big. They're easy to see. The caterpillars feed on trees. They're in cherry trees and in willow trees. So they're only using the prairies for the adults to nectar. And another thing, and I don't get too much into the caterpillars, I don't have pictures of them. The adult stage for butterflies is kind of the last hurrah. They spend most of their life as caterpillars or as eggs, spending the winters. You know, a tiger swallowtail might live for 3 or 4 weeks. One of the butterflies I'm going to talk about towards the end that we want to introduce, the adults live for maybe, if they're lucky, 2 weeks. Normally it's less than 10 days. So most of their life is spent as caterpillars. So, you know, these are butterflies that travel quite a bit. They can easily, you know, go, since they use the trees a lot, they can cover areas and come back to use our prairies. One of the butterflies that people really like to see and think of when they think of butterflies, and when you see publicity about butterflies, it's all about monarchs. And in our prairies, we have lots of monarchs. We have lots of blazing star, which is the purple flower in this slide, which is kind of the major monarch attractant that we have. So they'll come in. We have 6 different species of milkweeds that they can feed on. So we'll have, during a good year, thousands and thousands of butterflies, especially during early migration. So if you really want to see monarchs, go up to Crowhassan in last week of August, first week of September, and it looks like this in the morning with monarchs on the trees. We also get them on the goldenrods. So, you know, it is something that we can see, and they are doing well in our little piece of Hennepin County. But it is one, once again, it finds its way, because these are a migratory butterfly. They're not restricted to where they can go, which is really important. As long as they can find milkweed for the caterpillars and nectar for the adults, they can cover large territories. One butterfly that doesn't do that, and it's a butterfly that I think, because I'm biased, is prettier than a monarch, is the regal fritillary. This doesn't even do it justice. Those white spots on the back, on the underside of the wing, they're actually silver. So you can get a newly emerged one with it's black and silver and the bright orange, and they're as big as a monarch. They just have, so they're a big butterfly, and they actually can live for, especially the females, for a couple of months. So as an adult, they do have a longer lifespan than some of the other butterflies. But it is one that does feed, you know, it stays in prairies and has a hard time getting out. And it is an example that you can tell the difference. The females, the second row of females, must come out normally 2 or 3 weeks before the female, and then they just kind of hang around waiting for the bar to open. And as soon as the female come out, they become very harassing. And you see them flying around the prairies a lot, looking for the females, and the females tend to stay down in the grass if they're not nectaring. The one thing about this butterfly that makes it a little bit of a challenge is it only feeds, the caterpillars only feed on violets. So in the prairie, you need the prairie violets. So this is a prairie violet. That's they're not real big. A caterpillar can eat 3 or 4 plants per caterpillar over the course of the season. So what you want to do is get a really nice big stand of violets. And I wish we had one like this. This is actually Great Cloud Island Scientific Natural Area over in Washington County. And it has probably the densest violets around, but they don't have regal fritillaries. They can't get to that small, it's about 100-acre prairie complex just in the south end of Cottage Grove, and the butterflies haven't found it. If somebody needs to go and drop some off there. But the small plants, when they're not flowering, they're difficult to see. So in order to make sure that when we got ready to introduce this butterfly, we wanted to make sure we had enough violets. And we had violets in our prairies. They're difficult to survey, as you can see by where this person's hand is. So what we did is we planted a few, 10,000. We bought 10,000 4-inch potted violets over the course of 4 years. I tried to call up one of the prairie companies and try to order 10,000 in 1 year, and they laughed at me because they could not grow that many. And actually, it helped my budget because I could spread it out over 4 years. So we went out, and these are the pots. So there were 4-inch pots, so the bigger pots, and we would plant them in clumps of 6 or 7 violets, and then we move over and do another 6 or 7 violets and spread them out over the whole prairie. And so just to show the investment, each one of those, we spent about $40,000 buying the plants, and then another $10,000 or so of labor to plant all the plants. So it wasn't just the thing, oh, we want to bring butterflies back to the park. We invested into getting the butterflies there. So what we did is the light green blobs are where we kind of targeted the original planting of the violets so that we had it spread over the main part of the prairie. And then the other colors on there are for different projects that are going on. So we tried to get it so it was spread out. That way the butterflies are in all the different units, because I had mentioned earlier that we burn on a mosaic. So, if we put all the violets in one place, we could potentially burn everything up in 1 year. So this way we spread it out, and we spread the butterflies around when we released them to get into the park. So that's what we did the first 4 years. Then we went to catch butterflies. And basically you give all your staff nets, and you work through the prairies, and you get young staff that can run through the prairies, and when they do a face plant, they can get back up. If you get old and you do a face plant, you don't get up so quickly. And it's very easy to trip in some of these prairies. And we started in western Minnesota on some of the Fish and Wildlife Service, they call them waterfowl production areas. So they're little, normally a quarter section, 150 acres of prairie with a wetland in it. And we were catching a couple butterflies at each site. And when we got permission, we told them we'd only keep one of every 4, because we didn't want to be responsible for going in and catching all the butterflies off an isolated prairie. And we went out to western Minnesota probably 3 or 4 times and ended up coming back with about 5 butterflies, just because it was so hard to find them. And the staff didn't mind, because we always stopped at one of the Dairy Queens out in Starbuck or somewhere in western Minnesota on the way back. But we did go down to southeast Minnesota, which also has regal fritillaries, and found some private property. And within a couple hours, we caught 20 butterflies, came back, let go that 20 plus the other one. So basically we started with 25 female regal fritillaries, and we started doing surveys the next year. So we would go out and walk transects and count how many butterflies we could see. We also would do something similar to this, where we set up these 5-acre blocks and would line up 12 to 14 people with nets, and we would try to count every butterfly that was in that 5 acres, because that many people would scare them, so they would normally get up and start to fly away, and a lot of them would fly fast enough that they would just fly outside of our square. So we'd have somebody counting them as they left, and so that way we get a density of how many butterflies per acre. In the first year or so, we had a few, and then just before the pandemic, and before the drought. The pandemic didn't affect the butterflies at all. But before the drought, we had 1 year, our estimate was that there was about 5 to 6 butterflies per acre on Crowhasset. We have 900 acres of prairie. So we had thousands of butterflies. And when we were doing the transects, we were counting dozens and dozens of butterflies. And so then the drought set in and the numbers have dropped, but we still are finding maybe, 1 or 2 per acre, which is still better than the 25 we started with. And butterflies have some butterflies can quickly repopulate. So the regal fritillary can lay 2,000 eggs a year. So if you have 1,000 butterflies and they're each laying 2,000 eggs, you guys want to do the math? You have millions of eggs. So, the ability for the population to rebound is pretty good. So, that's the one thing we're doing. We still are seeing butterflies. We're seeing them areas of the prairie that we didn't release them in. And we kept some of the violets in our district nursery so we can collect the seeds. Trying to find seeds out in the middle of the prairie, these plants are really hard. So we're still going out every year and taking about a cup of violet seed, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the native seed world, most companies like Prairie Restoration probably doesn't get that much seed in a year. But with our nursery and our intensity of doing it, and we're throwing the seed out in new areas and trying to keep the diversity and increase the density of the violets throughout the park. So that was the first one. It was a lot of the quote unquote professional butterfly people kind of said, "Oh, it's not going to work. You guys aren't butterfly people, you're wildlife people." But butterflies are wildlife is what I told them, and it seemed to work. So, this is one. This is a female, so you can see the bottom row is white. We tried at one point to catch them and mark them, so we'd come back 2 weeks later and try to catch them again. It didn't work so well. I think we caught one of the ones we marked, but we just used the Sharpie and would make a little line on one of the orange wings. But it's just to show the size. So they're a decent sized butterfly. The other butterfly we're working with, or planning on working with, we've been agencies and partners for the last 3 to 4 years, is to bring back the Karner blue butterfly. And one of the challenges with this butterfly, besides some other things I'm going to say, so this is a federally endangered butterfly. So everybody has control over this butterfly except us. So, we have to work our way through all the permits and all the permissions and to prove to the people in charge that we know what we're doing. But it's just the idea that we have, I think, a really good habitat that we built that will host this butterfly. It's a small butterfly. I'll give you an example. So we went down to Fort McCoy, which is in Wisconsin, on your way to Madison. It has the largest population of Karner blue butterflies in the world. It has, on good years, over 100,000 butterflies of Karner blues. And just in case you don't see it, that's the butterfly. They're real little butterflies, and they live for 10 days. So it's kind of like, as I look back, it's like, why did I pick this one? But, if you go back, they're kind of a cool little butterfly. So it's kind of that charismatic microfauna. Instead of polar bears and pandas, we have little butterflies. And they're kind of cool. And it's a butterfly that is declining. And part of it is climate change. A lot of the populations in the southern part of its range, which is kind of northern Indiana and northern Illinois, have disappeared. And all the research shows that it has gotten too hot and too dry in the summer. So the Fish and Wildlife Service says that they need to try to do assisted migration to get them to the north and west of where the populations are now. So if you go north and west of Fort McCoy, that puts you right here in the Twin Cities. And so it's like, oh, that's a good way, good reason to do it. And we also have a lot of the other things that we need. This is also a butterfly where the caterpillars only feed on one plant. And that one plant is lupin. And we have hundreds and hundreds of acres of lupin in our prairie. So we have the food, I thought. but it turns out that Carner blues like lupin that grow in the shade. I don't know if any of you are prairie people or have prairie gardens, but everybody will tell you that lupin doesn't grow in the shade. But this butterfly only feeds on the ones that do grow in the shade. It's like, okay, another reason why am I doing this? So, it's kind of fun, but we do have some that grows in the shade, and we've been working on creating more savanna. So it's a savanna butterfly. So we went out and we actually mapped. We had seasonals walk all these, you see the big dots that are green and red and yellow, and then you see all the little white dots. So they basically walk through that whole part of the prairie. It's about 1.5 miles from the north to south end of where all the dots are. And so the red are really dense sites of lupin, green are good sites, and then the white, there are no lupin. And some of it does go into the woods. So once again, high tech here. So here, there is lupin along the edge of this one. Lupin is growing in this one up here, and then also along this one. Quite a bit of savanna that we've already planted. So we have some, we're trying to make more because we were told we didn't have enough yet. So on the other picture, the ones, the bright green with the lines, these are sites that we actually have a contract in right now, and they're going to go through and do a savannification of the woodlot. So basically we're going to open up the woodlot by removing some of the understory and then girdling some of the big trees. So we allow more sun to get into the woods. So then we can throw a lot of lupin seed. If you notice the first slide that showed all the lupin that was out there, we'll once again spend a couple days with our summer staff and our conservation corps crew. In the last couple of years, we've collected 250 gallons of lupin pods, which equals about 40 pounds of lupin seed. And then we just take and throw it around the prairie again. So this time we're going to target it into the woods. And just to show the effort, we tried to look around a couple of years ago for lupin seed, and most of the companies that we found might have had 20 to 30 pounds. We collected 40 pounds. And so, it is something that, we did. It's not, oh, we want to try this and see if it works. We're putting a lot of time and effort into getting this project going. This kind of ties in a little bit to what I was talking about, where the Carner blue are. So the orange is where they used to be pre-climate change and pre-European development. Right now, there's a little population in New Hampshire, small population in New York. And this is much bigger. This is a county, so it's one pine barrens area that you can find. But most of the population are in Michigan, in Wisconsin. This is the area where they disappeared from in the southern part of the range. And so we're up here at 45 degrees north. There's only one population in Wisconsin that's further north than that. And then this is Fort McCoy, where we want to catch them. So it is something that we'll bring the populations north and see how that goes. And then this is just a little more detail of where we are. So we're the yellow star on the big state map, which is Cohasset Park Reserve. The red dots are where Carner blues used to be found in Minnesota. So they are native to the state, but the population, the northern red star is Cedar Creek Ecological Reserve, and they disappeared there about 30 years ago when the highway department widened the road and took out the patch of lupin that they lived in. And then the population in the southern area is at Whitewater Wildlife Management Area. And it was just the lack of, the habitat got overgrown too much and it got too shady. So the blue dot is Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, which also has a lot of lupin and savanna habitat. So that could be a potential second site if we get them established at Cohasset. So they have an interest in them, but they didn't want to be the first ones to try to do it. So what we're going to do is continue to work on making more lupin in the shady areas in the park. We have a grant from the Minnesota Environmental Trust Fund through the Legislative Commission on Minnesota's Resources. So we got a $400,000 grant to improve the habitat and to do research on where the butterflies actually will survive. So it's a joint project with us and the University of Minnesota. They're bringing the scientists in to look at how caterpillars feed, what is the nutrient levels of the lupin leaves that are grown in the shade versus grown in the sun, how much shade do they need to build that stuff. So we're working with them to do the hardcore science end. We're doing the habitat management, which is what we're good at. So the hopes are at the end of this year, we can show enough information to the Fish and Wildlife Service that we can get a permit to let the butterflies, to collect butterflies down at Fort McCoy next year and then release them up here at Crowhasset. And we have other butterflies we've looked at as potentials. We're going to try to get this one done first. I think if we can get these established, our credibility will increase amongst the lepidopterists in the world, and they'll let us play with other butterflies. Or we'll just make sure we pick butterflies that don't have all kinds of state and federal regulations on them. That's the easier thing to do. But it is, we're looking at other plants. We know of other butterflies and moths that we're finding in our prairies that are rare. There's several moths that feed only on lead plant, which is another native plant, which we have in abundance in our prairies. And we found 3 species this year that had never been recorded from restored prairies. So they found it on their own. And they're little green and pink moths that sit on top of green and pink flowers. And it's
never recorded any?
Not in a restored prairie. So they're obligate to feed on the lead plant. Normally they've been found in native prairies. So this is a prairie that when we started, to give a little backstory on Crowhasset, when Europeans showed up, Crowhasset was all big woods. It was complete maple basswood forest. There was no prairie in Crowhasset. Between the 1820s and the 1960s, the settlers in that area converted over 1,700 acres of it to cornfields. So most of where all the prairies are in Crowhasset now had been agricultural lands prior to us acquiring the land. So it was easier in the 70s and 60s to plant prairie because we hadn't figured out how to restore prairie woodlands yet. So it's how we got started, but it functions as a prairie. It has high diversity, lots of the prairie birds. Figure bugs. The bugs feed the birds. It's all is all tied together, and we have really good diversity and density of a lot of the prairie birds. So meadowlarks and the Henslow sparrows and grasshopper sparrows are in this prairie and are doing much better in our prairie than they are statewide, just because we increase the habitat. So I'm going to leave it on that one. And if there's a lot of other stories about what we've done with butterflies, people we're working with. We have the Monarch Joint Venture, which has actually expanded to include most butterflies and not just monarchs. They've been trying to develop a machine learning, i.e. AI technique using drones that can actually identify all the different wildflowers. So they can fly over. And so they've been testing out some of their surveys in our area. So they're mainly looking to start with for being able to identify a milkweed. So what they do is they fly out and it marks all the milkweed it can find. And then they come back and they have people look at it on the screen because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to see. So just look for people that aren't milkweed. So like back here, and sometimes the colors aren't that different, but it's looking at a lot of different attributes. And that would, once they figure it out for the milkweed and other plants, it'll give us a good idea for all the wildflowers at any one time. It's a lot quicker to send a drone to do 3 or 4 transects across the prairie and then come back and have the computer analyze it than sending out 5 seasonals that we have to teach all the plants to beforehand, and they have to walk along with their iPads and click everything in. So seasonals would rather do this than pull weeds or cut buckthorn, But, it is, so we want them to be able to get out and learn the good plants as well. But it is something we could cover more territory. We haven't deliberately brought in new species to our other prairies, but we do manage our prairies very similarly. At Carver Park Reserve, at Highland, and at Murphy Hanrahan, we have some bigger prairies. We have smaller prairies in some of the regional parks and at like Baker and Rebecca, but they're not quite big enough to bring in special species to. They're good for the common butterflies, and they're also good for people to learn about prairies, but as far as making a true prairie ecosystem, they're not quite big enough. But other than that, I'd be glad to answer any questions and highlight get people to go out to Crowhouse. Yes.